Every family has its secrets, but some secrets have the power to shake the very foundation of trust and love. When I married Richard, I thought I was stepping into a life of warmth and stability, a loving husband, a cozy home, and the quiet hope of building a bond with his son David. But what began as cautious steps toward a blended family turned into a journey I never expected, one where silence became my shield, and a single confession threatened to unravel everything I held dear. My name is Mary. I want to tell you a story about something that happened in my family. It is not easy to talk about, but I hope you will listen. I married Richard 5 years ago. He is a good man, kind and hardworking. Richard has a son named David. David was 17 when I became his stepmother. At first, we didn't talk much. He was quiet, and I didn't want to push him. I thought he needed time to get used to me. David lived with us because his mother passed away when he was little. Richard worked long hours, so David and I spent a lot of time at home together. I tried to take care of him, cook for him, and make the house feel warm. One day I asked him, "How was school today?" David, he looked at me and said, "It was fine." That's all. He didn't say more. I smiled and said, "Okay, if you ever want to talk, I am here." He nodded and went to his room. Days turned into months, and slowly David began to open up. He started telling me about school, his friends, and the things he liked. I was happy to listen. I wanted him to feel like he had someone he could trust. But then something changed. One evening, we were eating dinner. Richard was away on a work trip. David looked at me and said, "You are very kind to me." I laughed a little and said, "Of course, David. I care about you." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes soft but serious. I felt nervous but didn't understand why. "What's wrong, David?" I asked. He shook his head and said, "Nothing." After that night, things felt different. David started spending more time with me. He would sit close when we watched TV or help me with chores around the house. I thought he just wanted to be nice, but sometimes the way he looked at me made me feel strange. I told myself, it's nothing. He's just a boy, but deep inside, I felt uneasy. One night, Richard was out late. David and I sat in the living room talking. He told me about his mother. "I miss her so much," he said. "She was the only one who really understood me." I felt sad for him. I reached out and held his hand. "I'm sorry, David," I said. "She would be proud of the man you are becoming." He looked at me again with those serious eyes. "Do you really think so?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I do." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David and the way he looked at me. I told myself, "You are his stepmother. You love Richard. There is nothing wrong here," but my heart felt heavy. I didn't know why. I tried to keep things normal. I cleaned the house, cooked food, and made sure David was okay. But inside I was confused. David was kind and sweet. He helped me with small things. If I dropped something, he would pick it up quickly. If I was tired, he would say, "You should rest. I'll take care of this." One day I was cooking in the kitchen. David came in and said, "Do you need help?" I smiled and said, "Sure, you can cut the vegetables." As we worked side by side, I felt happy. It was nice to have someone with me. But then David stopped cutting and looked at me, his eyes soft, like he wanted to say something important. "What is it, David?" I asked. "You make this house feel like home," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say. My heart felt warm but also scared. "Thank you," I said. "I'm glad you feel that way." After that day, David started spending more time near me. If I sat on the couch, he would sit close. If I was in the garden, he would come outside to talk to me. He always had something kind to say. "You're so caring, Mary," he told me once. "I wish my mom could have met you." His words made me feel special but also confused. I didn't know if I was reading too much into things. He's just a boy, I told myself again. But one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. Richard had gone out with his friends. I was in the living room reading a book. David came and sat next to me. "What are you reading?" he asked.
I showed him the book, and we started talking. We laughed about some funny parts of the story, and I felt at ease. But then David put his hand on mine. I froze. "David," I said softly. He looked at me and said, "I just want to thank you. You've been so kind to me." I pulled my hand away gently. "You don't need to thank me, David. We're family," I said, trying to smile, but inside, I felt something was not right. I went to bed early that night, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept thinking about David's hand on mine. Was it just a kind gesture, or was it something else? I prayed it was nothing. I told myself, "You're overthinking. It's all innocent." But deep down, I knew things were changing. The days after that night felt strange. I tried to act normal, but things didn't feel the same. I avoided being alone with David as much as I could. I told myself it was better this way. But David didn't seem to notice. He still found ways to be close. If I was in the kitchen, he would come and talk to me. If I was folding laundry, he would sit nearby and help. It was hard to ignore him, but I tried my best. One afternoon, Richard was working late again. I was cleaning the living room when David came in. "Do you need help, Mary?" he asked. "No, I'm fine," I said quickly. I didn't want him to stay. But he didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the couch and watched me. "You're always so busy," he said. "You never rest." I smiled a little and said, "There's always something to do in the house." He stood up and walked over to me. "You do so much for us," he said. "You make this house feel alive." "Thank you, David," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached out and touched my shoulder. It wasn't a big gesture, but it made my heart race. "David," I said firmly, stepping back. "What are you doing?" He looked at me, his eyes full of emotion. "I don't know how to say this," he said. "But I care about you more than I should." I froze. My mind was spinning. "David, stop," I said. "You can't talk like that. I'm your stepmother." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to run away, to make this stop, but I was too shocked to move. "David, this has to stop," I said finally. "This is not right. I love your father, and I care about you like a son, nothing more." He nodded, but his face looked hurt. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I just needed you to know." I walked out of the room and locked myself in my bedroom. My hands were shaking. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I kept thinking about Richard. And how much he trusted me. I felt like I had failed him, even though I had done nothing wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying David's words in my head. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell Richard? Should I ignore it and hope it never happened again? I decided to stay silent. I told myself it was just a moment of confusion for David and that he would move on. But deep down, I wasn't sure. After that day, I avoided David as much as I could. I didn't want to talk to him, and I didn't want to be alone with him. I told myself, if I keep my distance, things will go back to normal. But David didn't make it easy. He kept trying to talk to me. He would say things like, "Mary, can we talk?" or, "I didn't mean to upset you." I always found a way to leave the room or change the subject. One evening, Richard was home, and I felt safe. We all had dinner together. David was quiet, but I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't look at him. I focused on Richard and tried to act normal. After dinner, Richard went to his study to work. I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up. David came in and stood by the door. I pretended not to notice him. "Mary," he said softly. I didn't answer. I kept washing the dishes. "Mary, please," he said. "I'm sorry for what I said before. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I turned to him and said, "David, this is not something we can talk about. It's wrong, and it has to stop." "I know," he said, his voice full of regret. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw how much he was struggling. He wasn't trying to hurt me or cause problems. He was confused, just like I was. "David," I said gently, "this isn't good for you or for me. You need to find a way to move past this. You're a smart, kind young man. You have your whole life ahead of you." He nodded but didn't say anything. Then he walked out of the kitchen. I let out a deep breath, hoping this was the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, Richard had to leave for a business trip. I was nervous about being alone in the house with David, but I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't tell Richard. What would he think of me? That evening, David knocked on my bedroom door. I didn't answer. "Mary," he said from the other side, "I just want to talk." "Go to bed, David," I said firmly. There was silence for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for everything." I felt a pang of guilt. I didn't answer him, and eventually, I heard him walk away. That night, I sat on my bed feeling trapped. I loved Richard, and I wanted our family to be happy, but I didn't know how to fix this. David's feelings were not something I could control, and my silence was making everything worse. I started to wonder if I should tell Richard the truth. But what would happen if I did? Would he blame me? Would he get angry with David? The thought of breaking our family apart was too much to bear. So I stayed silent. I told myself it was the right thing to do, but deep down, I knew the silence was only making things harder. Richard's trip lasted a few days, and I was on edge the entire time. I kept busy around the house, avoiding any chance to be alone with David. I thought if I stayed strong and distant, everything would settle down. But David didn't stop trying to talk to me. Every little thing he did seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a longer look, a softer tone, or the way he tried to be close to me. I felt like I was walking on thin ice. One evening, I was sitting in the garden. The air was cool, and I thought it would help me clear my mind. I was staring at the flowers, lost in thought, when I heard footsteps behind me. "Mary," David said quietly. I turned to see him standing there, his hands in his pockets. I sighed. "What is it, David?" "Can we talk, just for a minute?" he said. I didn't want to, but I nodded. "Okay. What do you want to say?" He sat down on the bench next to me but kept some distance. "I've been thinking a lot," he began. "I know I've made things hard for you. I didn't mean to." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. I don't know how to stop feeling what I feel," he said, looking down at the ground. "But I don't want to hurt you or Dad." I felt a mix of sadness and frustration. "David, you have to understand something," I said softly. "I love your father. He's a good man, and I want us to be a happy family. What you're feeling is normal for someone your age, but you need to let it go." He nodded but didn't look at me. "I've tried," he said, "but it's hard." "I know it's hard," I said. "But it's the right thing to do. You're a good person, David. You'll find someone who feels the same way about you, but it's not me. We sat in silence for a long time. I hoped my words would help him understand. I wanted to believe that this was the end of it. That night, I locked my bedroom door again. I was afraid of what might happen if I didn't. I didn't want to think that David would do anything wrong, but I also didn't trust the situation. The next morning, David was quiet. He barely said a word at breakfast, and he left the house early. I felt a sense of relief but also worry. I didn't know what he was thinking or what he might do next. When Richard came home that evening, I felt a wave of safety wash over me. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't find the courage. I didn't want to ruin the peace we had. That night, as I lay in bed next to Richard, I realized I couldn't keep this secret forever. The silence was tearing me apart, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold it in. The next morning, I made a decision. After breakfast, I asked Richard if we could talk. "It's important," I said. He looked surprised but nodded. We sat in the living room. David had gone out, so it was just the two of us. My hands were shaking, and I could barely look at him. "Richard," I began, "I need to tell you something." His face grew serious. "What is it, Mary?" I took a deep breath. "It's about David." He leaned forward, his concern clear. "What about him? Is he okay?" "Yes, he's okay," I said quickly. "But he's been struggling with something, and it's been hard for me too." I told him everything. I told him how David had been acting differently, how he had said things that made me uncomfortable, and how I had tried to handle it on my own. I didn't blame David, but I didn't hide the truth either. Richard listened without interrupting. His face changed from confusion to anger to sadness. When I finished, he sat back and rubbed his face with his hands. "I can't believe this," he said softly. "My son. My own son." "I'm sorry," I said, tears in my eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you." Richard looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. "You should have told me sooner, Mary. I could have helped." "I was scared," I admitted. "I didn't want to ruin our family." He nodded slowly. "I understand. But we need to fix this. I need to talk to David." When David came home later that day, Richard called him into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, my heart pounding. I could hear their voices, but I couldn't make out the words. After a long time, Richard came to me. He looked tired but calm. "We talked," he said. "David knows what he did was wrong. He's going to stay with his aunt for a while to give us all some space." I felt a wave of relief but also sadness. "Do you think he'll be okay?" I asked. "He'll need time," Richard said. "But he's young. He'll learn and move on." I nodded, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt like things might be okay again. That night, as Richard and I sat together, he held my hand. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together." I looked at him and nodded. "Yes, together." And with that, I knew our family had taken the first step toward healing.